Good morning. My name is Samuel Zerzer from the Samuel Zerzer channel. Thank you for tuning in. Again, like always, always appreciate the good responses from you guys. We put a lot of effort because we're definitely at war. This is the quiet revolution, as they call it. Well, we all know what's going on. I mean, yesterday, there's just so much news that came out. We all know it's a corrupted system. With the FBI will come out. It was all a setup. I knew that was going to happen. But anyways, I just wanted to come out with the with the polling as of today. The USC Dornsife Los Angeles Times Daybreak poll. One of the best polls out there. It's an average weighted response from 0 to 100. They have 3,000 eligible voters. They vote. I mean, they actually poll 400 per day, a wide range, whether you're African American, Latino, white. I mean, they're pretty fair. Okay, this is one of the fair ones. It's updated as of November 7th, 2016, and still, even with the news, well, maybe took a little hit, Trump, of course, but still at 48. It was 48.1, one of the highs, 43.2. And it's Monday, so a lot can happen. And the gray zone is a degree of certainty. Okay, the gray zone. Okay, they call it margin of error, but I call it a certainty, and it's about 95% certainty. Anywhere in those lines, that's the gray zone. Okay, if you guys want to know, please go to the graphics.latimes.com, the USC, and you'll see. Now, we're just going to find out. I mean, you can go over it. I don't want to go much into this. Okay, I just want to know more or less, where is it trending? Is it the gender? I mean, is it by age? Let me see. Let me see where. Okay, it's still the same here. The 35 and over still voting for Trump. 65, a little bit less, still voting for Trump. By education, if you have high school or less, you're voting for Trump. College degree, you're still some college. If you're a brainiac, you have no common sense, obviously, that this person is corrupt. It's a corrupt system. I mean, you know, obviously, if you have a university degree, you're definitely brainwashed to the point where it's okay for socialism type of Venezuelan type of economy, where you see how it's blown up. Like Margaret Thatcher said, here, I'm going to talk your language. Socialism works until the money runs out, and the money does run out always in these countries. So just want to let you know. By income, still more or less the same. Nothing has really changed. Okay, seems like a Republican. By race, let me see. Whites, still the same. African Americans. Okay, this one is still suspect. I think they're not telling the truth on the phone. I think it's a lot more than that. But anyways, let me see. Oh, let me see. Yeah, it's the Spanish vote. Yeah, it went from 60%. He was the Republicans, or Trump was at 20, 60. Now it's at 46.7. Wow, loss of 15%. And look, it's November 7th. So it seems like the Latinos are voting for Trump. It seems like they're waking up. That they want somebody who can actually run an economy, not a socialist economy. They know what they were in Mexico, they were in Latin America. They know what it is to have a socialist government. Nothing works. Nothing. Zero. Here we go. So this is what I think the difference is. It's the Latino vote, the Spanish vote. Okay, so again, my name is Samuel Zerzer from the Samuel Zerzer channel. And good luck. And like I said, long live the Republic. Like I said, we're in God's hands here. That's it. You have the power. No matter how the system is corrupted, you have the power. The question is, how much are they going to rig the system? That's why he needs a landslide win, even just to be close to her. A landslide win. And yes, all hell will break loose November the 8th. Just mark my word. November 8th, all hell will break loose. My name is Samuel Zerzer again. For the Samuel Zerzer channel, thanks for tuning in. Godspeed.
She went on a 6-city tour to spotlight the challenges in community policing and the progress that's being made. She understands the importance of criminal justice reform, that we have to be smart on crime, not just tough. That's why she's committed to working as a partner to leaders with both parties who want to pursue reform that continues the trend of a falling crime rate and a falling incarceration rate. She understands the importance of protecting our national security while also securing our civil liberties. That's why she will safeguard the programs that are critical to protecting American lives and Americans' privacy. I see our FBI director, Jim Comey, who's here, and I know he's committed to doing the same thing. She lives out the words of one of our greatest attorney generals, Robert F. Kennedy. The glory of justice and the majesty of the law are created not just by the Constitution, nor by the courts, nor by the officers of the law, nor by the lawyers, but by the men and women who constitute our society, who are protectors of the law as they are themselves protected by the law. That's always been the story of our nation. Our strength does not come from the words we've written on the page or the laws we've put down on the books. It comes from ordinary citizens, generation after generation, who do their part to uphold our founding ideals. It comes from an unshakable faith in our ability to stand up for what is right and to admit where we've fallen short and then choose a better way forward. That was the cause to which Loretta dedicated her life long before she became America's top law enforcement officer. Today, the American people can have no greater advocate for their right to equality under the law.
And now our interview with Dr. Paul Craig Roberts, the father of Reaganomics and the former Assistant Treasury Secretary under Ronald Reagan.
I'm Paul Craig Roberts. I'm a former Assistant Secretary of the United States Treasury for Economic Policy. I was an Associate Editor of the Wall Street Journal, a columnist for Business Week, and Script Howard News Service. I'm currently a columnist for Creators Syndicate in Los Angeles. I'm an academic. I've held positions at Stanford University, Georgetown University, and other places. The most important issues of our time, as I see it, are the loss of the American middle class. Their jobs have been offshored, and the remaining jobs are being filled with foreigners brought in on work visas, so that we are dismantling the ladders of upward mobility that made the United States an opportunity society and that made differences in income distribution acceptable. Another great problem is that we have lost the law, and by that I mean the law that protects the innocent from the power of government, the law that is a shield of the people instead of a weapon in the hands of the state. And when you lose the law, you lose your civil liberties. And that means you have lost the Constitution. And another serious problem that we are suffering is the collection of power in the executive branch to the exclusion of the legislative and judicial branch. And so we are seeing grow up before our eyes dictatorial powers in the executive branch of the government. So these three are very serious problems for the United States. They threaten its political stability and the viability of the society itself. The Tyranny of Good Intentions was titled by me, How the Law Was Lost. And the book is about the destruction of the rights of Englishmen, which we know as the Bill of Rights, the legal principles that protect the innocent, that serve as a shield. And we are seeing all of these eroded, and the law is becoming a weapon in the hands of the state. And this book documents that for each of the protections among the Bill of Rights. It shows the erosion through prosecutorial abuse, various judicial rulings, and how Americans today do not have the protection of law. Perhaps one of the main contributing factors was that you had all sorts of agendas, single interest agendas, people chasing after devils. We got to do something about drugs. We have to do something about child abuse. We have to do something about crime. And so they made the mistake that Sir Thomas More warns against in the play A Man for All Seasons, that if you cut down the law in pursuit of your agenda, so what do you do when the devil turns around on you and you've lost the protection of the law? And that's exactly what has happened. We had various individual agendas that were deemed to be very important. For example, we have to do something about the mafia. We have to do something about drugs, and so on and so on. And so each one of these agendas, by pursuing it, eroded protective features in the law, and so the law was lost. The rising police state is already a product of losing the law, of the protective features of the law. That automatically gives you a police state. And in addition, we've had all the fear engendered by 9/11. And this fear was used for an even heavier assault on the Bill of Rights, the assault on habeas corpus, which prevented indefinite detention without charges. We've lost that right. All the due process rights, all the procedural rights that make it possible to enforce civil liberties. You can tell somebody they have a right, but if you take away the procedural mechanisms by which that right's enforced, they don't have the right. The erosion of our legal protections began long before 9/11 or the Bush administration. It was already moving along, and that made it easier then for the Bush regime to use
work emails demonstrating a tremendous enmity towards conservatives. And some of those groups wanted to do nothing more than just educate their fellow citizens about the Constitution. And so I'm sure you can appreciate the irony of Lois Lerner punishing people who want to educate their fellow citizens about the Constitution, and then she comes and hides behind it to avoid answering questions about her conduct. That's why people are upset. And then you add to that the President of the United States, the person who campaigned.
Squad cars and scores of officers, and they're heavily armed. And it sounds like a war. I mean, they must shoot up thousands and thousands of dollars of ammunition. And I've gone there, and they've been there, for example, like 3 days in a row, just blasting away the same county even. And I stopped once and I asked him, I said, what are you doing? You practicing for some kind of competition? You know, you've got some big tournament coming up. And they said, oh no, we're practicing to win the shootout. And the shootout, and it was a small mountain type town area. And I said, there? Who are you going to have a shootout with us? And he said, them terrorists. Well, who are the terrorists? There clearly never be any that locale. And I think they're just preparing to put down any kind of public opposition or protest that might arise. And I think that's the reason the police are being militarized. They now are equipped by the Department of Defense with military weapons. Some jurisdictions apparently even have helicopter gunships and tanks. And they've got rocket-propelled grenades. And it's an amazing array of weapons for police, which are essentially supposed to be an investigative force to solve crimes and make a case against whoever committed a crime and present it to the prosecutor. That's what the police are supposed to do. But they're becoming like an occupation force. And they're undergoing military training with military weapons. This is an enormous departure from the role of police in the United States or in any democracy. What we can say about the G20 is that it showed two things. One, that the rest of the world is losing faith in the dollar as reserve currency, because this was what was on the minds of most of the people there. Whatever the agenda was, the real agenda on everyone's mind was the dollar. We're holding all our reserves in dollars, and you're inflating it away, and we have to do something about this. We need some alternative way of settling international transactions. So I think that was an indication that the rest of the world is losing confidence in the United States and in the dollar as a reserve currency. Now, the behavior of the police shows, again, the militarization of the police, because they were very aggressive toward people who weren't causing any trouble. And I believe the police were, frankly, disappointed that there wasn't more trouble for them to beat up on, and so they, on their own, went into neighborhoods with their new weapons or protest suppression systems, and just sort of arbitrarily abused people. So it's a further indication that the police agencies of the government are now separate from people that they're supposed to protect. It's taken many blows. It began probably with Abraham Lincoln and what's called the Civil War, because this destroyed the notion of a republic and states' rights. And it took another heavy blow in the Depression, with Franklin Roosevelt and the New Deal, because that essentially took away the legislative power of Congress. You see, it used to be when Congress passed a law, they dotted every I, they crossed every T, and the regulatory agencies, that is, there really weren't any. The executive agencies had to enforce the law as Congress wrote it. But during the New Deal, the executive branch gained the power to write the regulations that implement the law. And so, in effect, they gained the power to write the law. So that when Congress passes a bill today or a statute, what it really is it gives some executive agency the right to write the law by how it interprets it with its regulations. So Congress has lost essentially its legislative power back in the New Deal. And then what we've seen recently with the Bush regime is how Congress just acquiesced time and again into executive claims that it was the superior branch of government, and that Congress was there, but it wasn't really on an equal basis, and that the power of the president exceeded that of the power of the Congress and of the judiciary, so that you had an executive making claims that they were above the law and not bound by the law. And we saw the memos that came from the Department of Justice, John Yoo and the others, that basically said the president is not bound by the United States statutory law against torture, and nor is he bound by the Geneva Conventions that we've signed and essentially originated against torture. He's not bound by the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act. He can spy on Americans without a warrant, even though the law says he can't. These kinds of claims elevate the president into a dictator. And then they use signing statements and various executive orders and directives to accumulate more and more power. And it's true, no president yet has tried to exercise all these powers at once, but they're there. And anytime there's a crisis that they can hide behind to use as a justification, then you now have enormous powers that the president can claim that were totally foreign to the Constitution, to the Founding Fathers, and to most of our experience. The American Empire took on new meaning after the collapse of the Soviet Union, because even though there was a form of empire prior to that, any notion of U.S. hegemony was checked by the Soviet Union. It was a formidable military force, had huge amounts and numbers of nuclear weapons. You know, the Red Army had defeated Germany, and Europe was still terrified. So the notion that we had an empire was somewhat different compared to what was possible when the Soviet Union collapsed, because we very quickly broke all our agreements that Reagan had made with them and began behaving aggressively. And it let the neoconservatives start preaching empire in a new way, by which it means to them U.S. hegemony over the whole world. You know, that we simply rule the world. And they had not just military justifications for that, but they had these justifications that we are an exceptional people, and that we are the virtuous people. And so we not only had the right, we had the responsibility, the obligation to impose ourselves on the world. So this form of empire is new. The funny thing about this new empire is it's coinciding with the beginning of large-scale jobs offshoring. So while we are telling ourselves, hey, look, we are this new world empire, there's nobody to block us, we're sending all the manufacturing jobs to China, all the middle-class engineering jobs, the software engineering jobs, the information technology jobs, everything that people were using to rise up, to have upward mobility and to have a strong middle class, we start destroying that. So we are destroying one of the bases for being powerful, just at the same time that we get this notion that we are. And the same with the dollar. We start then, because of all the offshoring, the trade deficit explodes. You see, if you take production that you're making in the United States and you move it abroad, you've destroyed it here and you've created it to wherever you moved it. It's now Chinese, for example. When it comes back, it's an import. And so the offshoring creates huge trade deficits. Well, and that then puts the pressure on the dollar. So that's the funny thing about this new neocon version of empire, that it rose up right while we were destroying the middle class, the manufacturing base, the engineering jobs, the middle class jobs, and the dollar. We're destroying the dollar in the process. Well, the only real reason that we were a superpower was that the dollar is the reserve currency, which means we can pay our bills in our own currency. We don't have to earn enough from exporting. We don't have to earn enough foreign exchange.
With Clause 4 of House Rule 16, the chairman be authorized to declare a recess at any time. Without objection, so ordered. Once again, I want to welcome all. Dr. Hall, I want to welcome you to our hearing on your CBO budget and economic outlook going forward. When you talk about budgets, oftentimes people's eyes glaze over, but these numbers matter. The consequences for the American people are real about the numbers that we'll talk about today, and I think that will become much more clear as we move through this hearing. This hearing is focused on the Congressional Budget Office's recently released Budget and Economic Outlook. In its report, CBO projects that if no changes are made to current policies, deficits over the next decade will total $9.4 trillion. This is up from $7.6 trillion from the estimate just last year. National debt will rise to over $29 trillion by 2026, from its current all-too-high of $19 trillion. And average economic growth over the next 10 years will be a disappointing 2.1% on an annualized basis, a full one-third lower than historical average. For individuals and families and businesses, this slow growth and skyrocketing debt will mean less opportunity, fewer jobs, and smaller paychecks, and a nation increasingly vulnerable to national security threats both at home and abroad. This isn't an optimistic outlook for America. It's not a sustainable outlook for any nation, and the longer we take to address these challenges.
And the world, I think, would continue supporting the dollar and give us time. It would take years, of course, and give us time to get our act back into balance. You'd have to get the budget back into balance, and you'd have to get the trade balance back into balance. And instead of getting the budget deficit under control, we've blown it up by 4 times. It's 4 times greater this year than last year. Instead of dealing with the wars and saying, hey, what are we doing this for? We're expanding it. We're putting more troops into Afghanistan. We're putting more pressure on Iran. So we're sending the signals that we're going to continue the extravagance that has put the dollar under so much pressure and made it decline in value, even against the Botswana pula. The United States dollar, over the course of its life, has become a fiat currency. It didn't start out that way. It started out backed by gold and to some extent in different times by silver. And it therefore was commodity money. It actually could be redeemed in precious metals. Americans could still exchange paper currency for gold and silver in the early part of the 1930s until President Roosevelt made them turn in the gold. And therefore he took the domestic economy off of gold and made it a fiat currency, except there were still a few Federal Reserve notes that were silver certificates and were backed by silver, and the coinage remained silver. As the fiat part of the currency expanded, it put pressure on the ability to maintain a silver coinage, and they got rid of that in 1968. And so that was the last of our silver coinage. They also got rid of the silver certificates that were Federal Reserve notes. And then in the early 70s, Nixon ended any gold connection to the dollar in international transactions. So between the early 30s and the early 70s, foreigners still had the right to exchange paper dollars for gold. And that was the basis on which the dollar became reserve currency, taking the place of the British pound after World War II. But as the supply of paper dollars grew and grew, the rest of the world began to see that they couldn't be converted into gold. And when the French made an effort to convert their holdings of dollars into gold and asked the United States government to take the dollars back and give them the gold equivalent, Nixon closed the gold window. And so since the early 70s, there's been no connection between the currency of the United States and precious metals. We still had a copper penny. The penny was still a commodity money, and that ended in the early years of the Reagan administration. I can still remember the Treasury meeting when they said they were going to take the copper out of the penny, and I protested, and I said, well, you mean we can't even have an honest penny? What kind of country have we become? This is the situation today. It's a paper that can be printed endlessly. And yet there has been a certain amount of discipline. They have not really run the presses because they've been able to finance their budget deficits through issuing bonds, and people buy the bonds. And when the American saving rate evaporated, the trading partners of the United States, who had large trade surpluses with the United States, used their trade surpluses to buy the Treasury's bonds. And so the money that we would pay out to them for imports would recycle and then come back and finance the government's budget. So we haven't really had to print money on the level of a banana republic in order to finance the current operating expenditures of the government until recently. It's coming upon us because the fiscal year deficit in 2009 is 4 times larger than the fiscal deficit of 2008. And it's much larger than the trade surpluses of our trading partners. And therefore, there's not enough dollars to recycle to finance the deficit. And the same thing is occurring in 2010. The deficit, again, is huge. And the government itself forecasts it's going to be $1 trillion a year for the next decade. So that's 2.5 times for 10 years the size of the 2008 deficit. And the rest of the world doesn't have this kind of surplus savings or surplus from their trade with the United States to buy all these bonds. So there's no way to finance them, in my view, except to print the money. One exception would be another decline in the stock market. If the stock market busts again, which it's likely to do, then people fleeing for safety will buy the bonds because that's traditional. I mean, it's habit. It's the way people behave when they get scared of in stocks. They run and get into government bonds, and they still think the Treasury is a safe place to be. So that could finance a near-term deficit, but that'll only work once because, you know, after the stock market crashes again, it's not likely to have a whole lot of people going back into it. So that's what we face. We face these very large deficits for which there's no obvious way of financing them except to create new money. And the way that happens is when the Treasury takes a bond, takes its new debt to auction. It says, okay, this year we've got X billion, this quarter we've got X billion of Treasuries, and submit your bids, and there are not enough bids to take the bonds, then the Federal Reserve steps in and buys them by creating checking accounts for the Treasury, and that is how they print money. All of a sudden, there's billions, tens of billions of new money created just because the Federal Reserve makes an entry in a book, and it takes the bonds and creates the money to pay for them. Now, when you start doing that, you're telling the whole world that you're printing money, and if the whole world is still holding dollars and they see that's going on, they're going to try to get out of them pretty quickly. And as they get out of them, then who's going to buy those? They're trying to sell them. Everybody's trying to sell. What happens to the price? the exchange value of the dollar is the price relative to other currencies, and it starts dropping. And so who buys them? The Fed creates more money to redeem the bonds that nobody wants. And this is why some people see hyperinflation in our near to intermediate term future, sometime within the next 5 years. Once hyperinflation starts, it moves very quickly. And if it coincides with high unemployment, you have a crisis that we've never experienced. You know, the Great Depression, when everyone was unemployed, you had high unemployment, but prices were stable or falling. To have high unemployment and rapidly rising prices, when people have no way of getting income, this is a devastating social situation. It has the possibility and the potential of destroying the society and the political order. And this receives no attention. They're not giving any attention to this. Walked into Neiman Marcus. You see what I'm saying? The minute the dollar declines to the Chinese currency, wow, prices are going to rise. People don't have incomes already. How are they going to pay these prices? So just the complete absurdity of the whole thing. I mean, it's really an absurd situation that we have gotten in, and it shows a complete failure of leadership. Politically, intellectually, business-wise, and the people themselves. They don't pay any attention. Who knows about this? It's the laid-off people who know about it. The ones who are laid off. Everybody else is somewhere else. How bad can it get? It can get worse. And it will get worse. And it's also the reason why the traditional stimulus programs to deal with unemployment don't work. You see, in the post-World War II period, recessions were generally engineered by the Federal Reserve in order to cool down labor demands for higher wages, and because they thought that was inflationary, and they would, anytime the economy got booming, they'd just turn off the money, cause a recession, let things cool down, then they'd start the money back and things would pick back up. Well, the jobs were still there, so the factories could call the workers back to work. But the jobs aren't there anymore. So to say, hey, here's easy credit, look, we've got historically low interest rates. We've got historically high budget deficits. Both of these things are considered to be major stimuli to the economy. And yet nothing's happening. Nothing is happening. And why? Because the jobs aren't there. Certainly over the course of its history, the Federal Reserve has caused a lot of problems. For example, right after it was created, it caused the Great Depression. It didn't do it on purpose, but it failed in its responsibility to be the lender of last resort to the banks. And when the banks were failing because of runs on the banks and the inability to call in loans fast enough to pay off depositors, it was a responsibility of the Federal Reserve to get up carloads of cash and rush over to the bank and deliver it so they could pay off the customers and stop the runs. And as the banks failed, the money supply shrank. You know, every time a bank failed, in those days, there was no FDIC, no guaranteed deposits. So when a bank failed, the money supply shrank by the amount of the deposits in the bank. So there were a lot of bank failures, so the money supply was shrinking. And the Federal Reserve did take expansionary actions. They just never took them enough to offset the shrinkage. they misjudged or they didn't know what they were doing or something. But the net effect was the supply money shrank, you know, by 25%, by a third. Well, if the supply of money shrinks, you can't maintain the same level of purchases and employment. And so when you shrink the supply of money, you shrink sales, you shrink employment, you get unemployment, you get falling gross national product. And that's what happened. And the entire decade of the 30s was troubles, serious troubles for people whose whole lives were disrupted. And it was because the Fed failed to do what it was established for. Now, so either this means that there's not enough competence to go with the power, or there's not enough accountability to be sure that they're doing the right thing. Maybe they're too independent. Maybe there needs to be additional levels of oversight so that these kinds of mistakes don't happen. And since the end of World War II, we've had the opposite problem. Instead of shrinking the money supply, they've let it grow too fast. And so we've had inflation. There's enormous inflation over my lifetime. Enormous. And that means the Federal Reserve is conducting policy inappropriately. They weren't established to create inflation. You see, if you've got 3, 4, 5, 6% inflation year after year after year, it compounds. And the value of the dollars ends up worthless. You can be very critical of the Fed. You can say it's done far more harm than good. The reason they made it independent was they didn't trust the government not to manipulate it. But you can't trust the government, that's for sure, but you can't trust anybody with unaccountable power. So you have the same problem. And I think what it really comes down to is anytime you have unaccountable power, then you have a greater range for misbehavior, a greater range for mistakes that go unrecognized and uncorrected. And this is a cost for the system. And it becomes an even greater cost if the currency is a fiat currency that itself is not limited by some amount of precious metal, gold or silver, or limited in some way. When the currency becomes essentially unlimited by anything except the need to print it, it's clear the tremendous amount of bank reserves that they've created are not finding their way from the banks into an expansion of the money supply. It's simply they're sitting on the reserves. But if the Fed's creating money in another way, which is printing it so the government can pay its bills, then that money is sooner or later got to find its way into prices. And the more unemployment there is, the quicker it'll find its way into prices because there's less goods to absorb the money. So it drives them up. The Federal Reserve published in April of 2008 that the existing money supply, by which they meant currency in circulation and checking accounts, was 1.4 trillion. That was the money supply in spring of 2008. Now, the budget deficit in 2009, a year later, is 1.4 trillion. If they had to print 1.4 trillion to pay that deficit, the money supply would have doubled in 1 year, right? Next year, they say the deficit is going to be 1.4 trillion. If they had to print the money in 2010 to cover the budget deficit, the money supply would have tripled in 2 years. If something like this happens, that they have to print these huge sums of money, the inflation is going to start up. And look at the enormous reserves in the banking system that are there to be drawn on to fuel the inflation. Once prices start rising, then if real estate prices go up, then people's homes are out of trouble. That's one way to get rid of the real estate crisis, is to inflate away the value of the mortgage debt. Once that starts, the banks will be lending everywhere. And so you would have a tremendous ability for a massive inflation, and a long-lived one. And how would you stop it? The only way these things have ever been stopped is they just say, okay, that currency no longer exists. We're creating a new one. One new dollar is equal to 100 trillion old dollars. These are all implications of what is going on. And when the implications of what you're doing are so dire, you should stop. But we don't. We don't stop. The Afghan war, at a minimum, it's just in out-of-pocket expenses, it's $100 billion a year. Now, if you then count the incurred medical care for the troops for the rest of their life, the cost of replacing all the equipment that gets blown up, the loss of $100 billion of resources for better uses, the cost of the war is huge. We're not in a position we can afford any such war. Particularly, when we have to borrow it and then pay the interest on $100 billion to the Chinese. It's not sensible. And the things that we do are not sensible. I can't think of anything that the United States government does that's sensible. I can't think of any policy that's working.
Remember, lovers of liberty, these video interviews have all been exclusive, and they're going to be archived at prisonplanet.tv. Please download them, burn them to disk, and give them to everyone you know. Upload them to YouTube. This information is vital not just to our free republic, but to the future of free humanity.